The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas ranch as Robert Blackstone stood watching the most expensive mistake of his life. In the far paddock, a massive black horse paced back and forth like a caged tiger. This wasn't just any horse. This was Thunder, an 18-hand Clydesdale stallion that weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and had the temperament of a tornado. Robert pulled his cowboy hat lower over his eyes and took a sip of his morning coffee. The bitter taste matched his mood perfectly. 6 months ago, he thought he was making the deal of a lifetime. Now he wasn't so sure. It all started at the annual horse auction in Kentucky. Robert had built his fortune in the oil business, and like many wealthy Texans, he wanted the best of everything. His ranch already housed some of the finest horses money could buy, but when Thunder walked into that auction ring, something changed. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Thunder's Wrath, a purebred Clydesdale stallion standing 18 hands high. This magnificent animal comes from champion bloodlines and—" The auctioneer never finished his sentence. Thunder reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing at the air like he was fighting invisible demons. The handler holding his lead rope was yanked forward and barely managed to stay on his feet. The crowd gasped as Thunder's massive frame blocked out the arena lights. Most people in the auction house took a step back. Robert took a step forward. He had never seen such raw power in an animal before. Thunder's muscles rippled under his midnight black coat. His mane flowed like liquid darkness. When those wild eyes swept across the crowd, Robert felt like the horse was looking straight into his soul. $2 million, Robert called out, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. The auction house fell silent. Even the auctioneer seemed stunned. The starting bid was supposed to be $50,000. Did I hear $2 million? The auctioneer asked, his voice shaking slightly. You heard right, Robert replied, crossing his arms. No one else dared to bid. Who would compete with a man crazy enough to offer $2 million for a horse that looked ready to tear the place apart? Sold to bidder number 47 for $2 million. As Robert walked down to complete the paperwork, he could hear people whispering behind him. Some called him brave, others called him stupid. But Robert didn't care about their opinions. He had made his fortune by taking risks that others wouldn't take. This horse would be no different. The problem started the moment Thunder arrived at the ranch. The transport company that brought him from Kentucky looked like they had been through a war zone. The trailer had dents in the sides where Thunder had kicked. The driver's hands were shaking as he backed the trailer up to the loading dock. Mister, I've been hauling horses for 20 years, the driver said, wiping sweat from his forehead. But I ain't never dealt with nothing like this. He kicked the whole way here, didn't stop for 8 hours straight. When they opened the trailer door, Thunder exploded out like he had been shot from a cannon. 3 ranch hands scattered in different directions as the massive horse charged into the paddock. He immediately began running along the fence line, his hooves thundering against the ground. Beautiful animal, said Diego, Robert's head ranch manager. But I've got to tell you, boss, I don't think I've ever seen a horse this worked up before. Robert watched Thunder race around the paddock, kicking at the air and snorting like a steam engine. He just needs time to settle in. Once he realizes this is his new home, he'll calm down. Diego didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. Whatever you say, boss. The first trainer Robert hired was a man named Bill Crawford. Bill had 30 years of experience breaking horses and came highly recommended. He took one look at Thunder and shook his head. I'll do my best, Bill said. But this horse has got issues. Something's got him all twisted up inside. Bill lasted exactly 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Robert found him packing his truck. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackstone, Bill said, not meeting Robert's eyes. I can't work with that horse. Yesterday he nearly took my head off with his teeth. Today he tried to kick me through the fence. I got a family to think about. Robert tried to convince Bill to stay, offering him double his usual fee. But Bill just shook his head and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. The second trainer was a woman named Carol Martinez. She specialized in problem horses and had a reputation for being able to handle the difficult ones. She brought her own equipment and set up camp in the guest house. I've seen worse, Carol said confidently as she watched Thunder pace around his paddock. This horse just needs someone who understands his language. Carol lasted 2 weeks. She tried everything from gentle training techniques to more assertive methods. Nothing worked. Thunder seemed to get more aggressive with each passing day. On her last morning at the ranch, Carol sat on the porch with Robert, an ice pack pressed against her shoulder. "He got me pretty good yesterday," she said, wincing as she moved her arm. "Knocked me clean into the fence post. I've been training horses for 15 years, and I've never met one with this much anger." "What do you think is wrong with him?" Robert asked. Carol was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder in the distance. "I don't know. Sometimes horses get like this when they've been abused or traumatized. But his previous owner swore he was never mistreated. Maybe it's just his nature. Some animals are born wild and stay wild no matter what you do." After Carol left, Robert tried hiring trainer after trainer. They came from all over the country. Some were young and fearless. Others were old and experienced. None of them could make any progress with Thunder. There was the trainer from California who specialized in natural horsemanship. Thunder sent him to the hospital with a broken wrist. The trainer from Colorado, who used a technique called join up, lasted only 5 days before Thunder chased him clean out of the paddock. Even the famous horse whisperer from Montana couldn't get within 10 feet of Thunder without the horse going into a rage. Each failed attempt cost Robert more money and damaged his reputation. Word began to spread through the horse community that Robert Blackstone had bought himself an untamable monster. People started calling Thunder the $2 million lawn ornament. The veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Wells, examined Thunder from a safe distance. She couldn't get close enough for a proper examination, but from what she could see, the horse was in perfect physical health. "There's nothing wrong with his body," she told Robert. "His eyes are clear, his coat is shiny, and he moves like an athlete. The problem is in his mind." "Can you give him something to calm him down?" Robert asked. Dr. Wells shook her head. "I could prescribe tranquilizers, but that's just putting a bandage on the problem. It wouldn't really fix anything. Besides, with a horse this size and this aggressive, sedating him could be dangerous." As the months passed, Thunder became more isolated. Robert had to move him to a paddock far from the other horses because his presence made them nervous. The massive stallion spent his days pacing along the fence line, his head held high, watching everything with suspicious eyes. The ranch hands started avoiding Thunder's area altogether. They would take longer routes to their work areas just to stay away from his paddock. Even Diego, who had worked with difficult horses his whole life, admitted he was intimidated. "It's like he's looking for a fight," Diego told Robert one evening as they watched Thunder from a safe distance. "Most horses, even the difficult ones, they'll calm down eventually, but not this one. He seems to get more wound up every day." Robert found himself spending hours just watching Thunder, trying to understand what made the horse so angry. Sometimes he would sit on the porch with his morning coffee and study Thunder's movements. The horse never seemed to rest. Even when he stood still, his muscles were tense, ready to explode into action at any moment. The local feed store owner, an old man named Pete, had heard about Robert's problem and offered some advice. "Some horses are just broken inside," Pete said, scratching his gray beard. "Like people, I suppose. You can throw all the money in the world at them, but if they don't want to heal, they won't heal." "But there has to be something," Robert insisted. "I've spent a fortune on trainers and equipment. There has to be a way to reach him." Pete looked out toward Thunder's paddock, where the massive horse was running along the fence line for what seemed like the 100th time that day. "Maybe," Pete said slowly. "But maybe the right person just hasn't come along yet. Sometimes it takes a special kind of person to understand a special kind of problem." Robert's wife, Linda, had been patient with his expensive hobby for months, but even she was starting to lose hope. "Honey, maybe it's time to admit this isn't working," she said one evening over dinner. "That horse is costing us a fortune in vet bills and trainer fees, and he's not getting any better." "I can't give up now," Robert replied, pushing his food around on his plate. "I've invested too much in him." "It's not about the money," Linda said gently. "It's about what's best for the horse. Maybe he'd be happier somewhere else." But Robert couldn't bring himself to sell Thunder, Despite all the problems, despite all the failed attempts to train him, Robert still saw something special in the massive stallion. When Thunder ran, it was like watching pure power in motion. When he reared, the smoke from expensive cigars hung thick in the air of the Cattlemen's Club, Austin's most exclusive private establishment. The monthly poker game was in full swing, and the stakes were higher than usual. Around the green felt table sat some of Texas's wealthiest men, each one trying to outdo the others with stories of their latest acquisitions and business victories. Robert Blackstone sat quietly, his cards held close to his chest, but his mind wasn't really on the game. It had been 8 months since Thunder arrived at his ranch, and the horse was still as wild as the day he stepped off that trailer. Every week brought new reminders of his expensive failure. "I'll raise you 50,000, said Charles Rothschild, tossing chips into the center of the table with the casual confidence of a man who had never known financial worry. Charles owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Southwest and had a reputation for being ruthless in both business and poker. "Call," replied William Hayes, the owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. "Easy money tonight, boys." Robert folded his hand and leaned back in his leather chair, taking a sip of his bourbon. The liquid burned slightly, but it was nothing compared to the burn of embarrassment he felt every time someone mentioned his horse problem. "Speaking of easy money," Charles said with a sly grin, "I heard you're still feeding that expensive pet of yours, Robert. What do you call him?" "Thunder?" The table went quiet. Everyone knew about Robert's horse situation, but Charles was the only one bold enough to bring it up directly. The 2 men had never liked each other much, and Charles seemed to enjoy poking at Robert's sore spots. "Thunder's doing just fine," Robert replied evenly, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Oh, I'm sure he is," Charles chuckled, dealing the next hand. $2 million for a horse that no one can ride. That's quite an investment strategy." William Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Charles, maybe we should focus on the cards." But Charles wasn't done. He had been drinking steadily all evening, and alcohol had a way of loosening his tongue. "I mean, I've heard of expensive lawn ornaments before, but this takes the cake. At least my wife's garden sculptures don't try to kill the gardener." Robert's knuckles went white as he gripped his glass. The other men around the table shifted in their seats, sensing the tension building. "That horse has champion bloodlines," Robert said quietly. "He just needs the right approach." "The right approach?" Charles laughed loudly. "Robert, you've had more trainers than some people have had haircuts. How many was it? 15? 20? At what point do you admit you bought yourself a very expensive problem?" The poker game had completely stopped now. Cards lay forgotten on the table as everyone watched the confrontation unfold. Robert stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "What exactly are you trying to say, Charles?" "I'm saying you got taken for a ride, old friend. You let your ego write a check that your judgment couldn't cash. That horse is unrideable, and everyone in 3 states knows it." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, not because they weren't true, but because they were. Every failed trainer, every damaged fence, every day that Thunder spent pacing in his paddock was proof that Charles was right. But something about the smug satisfaction on Charles's face pushed Robert over the edge. All the frustration and embarrassment of the past 8 months came bubbling to the surface. "You think you know so much about horses?" Robert asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know enough to spot a losing proposition when I see one," Charles replied, leaning back in his chair with an arrogant smile. Robert stared at Charles for a long moment, his mind racing. Then, without really thinking about what he was doing, he heard himself say, "I'll bet you $5 million that someone can ride Thunder." The room went dead silent. Even the background noise from the club's restaurant seemed to fade away. Charles's smug expression slipped slightly. "Excuse me?" Charles said. "You heard me," Robert continued, his voice gaining strength. $5 million says that someone somewhere can not only ride Thunder but keep him calm for 10 full minutes. William Hayes nearly choked on his drink. "Robert, are you serious?" "Dead serious," Robert replied, never taking his eyes off Charles. "Unless, Charles here is all talk and no action." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in the Old West. Charles's face had gone red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. "$5 million is a lot of money, Robert," Charles said slowly. "It is indeed." Robert agreed. "Too much for you?" Charles's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of the other club members. "I didn't get where I am by backing down from a sure thing. You're on." The other men around the table exchanged glances. They had just witnessed what might be the craziest bet in Texas history. Wait," said Thomas Mitchell, a silver-haired oil executive. "Let's make sure we're all clear on the terms here. Robert, you're betting $5 million that someone can ride your horse Thunder for 10 minutes while keeping the horse calm?" "That's right," Robert confirmed. "And Charles, you're betting $5 million that it can't be done?" Charles nodded, though he looked less confident than he had a few minutes earlier. "We'll need witnesses," said William Hayes, who despite his shock was already thinking like the lawyer he used to be. "And we'll need to define what calm means." "No bucking, no rearing, no aggressive behavior," Robert said. "The rider has to stay on for 10 full minutes and the horse has to behave like a trained animal, not a wild bronco." "And how long do we have to find this miracle rider?" Charles asked. Robert thought for a moment. 30 days. "If no one can do it in 30 days, I pay you $5 million. If someone does it, you pay me." "Make it 60 days, Charles countered. "I want to be fair." Robert almost laughed at that. Charles had just called his horse an expensive lawn ornament, and now he was worried about being fair. But he nodded his agreement. 60 days it is. Thomas Mitchell pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. We need to get this in writing before anyone sobers up and changes their mind." As the lawyer was contacted and the formal bet was being arranged, word of the wager began to spread throughout the club. By the time Robert left that night, half of Austin's social elite had heard about the $5 million horse bet. The coup. Next morning, Robert woke up with a mild hangover and the sinking realization of what he had done. Linda was reading the newspaper at the breakfast table when he came downstairs. "Good morning, honey," she said without looking up. "How was poker night?" "Fine," Robert replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "That's funny," Linda said, turning a page. "Because according to the society section here, you made a $5 million bet that someone can ride Thunder." Robert nearly dropped his coffee cup. "It's in the paper already?" Linda looked up at him with raised eyebrows. "Robert Blackstone, what on earth were you thinking?" Before Robert could answer, his phone started ringing. It was Diego calling from the ranch. "Boss, you better get out here," Diego said, his voice tense. "We've got reporters at the gate and they're asking about some bet you made last night." "Reporters?" Robert felt his stomach drop. "Yeah, and not just local ones. I think I saw a van from one of them cable news channels." Robert hung up the phone and looked at Linda, who was still staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Have to go to the ranch," he said weakly. "Yes, you do," Linda replied. "And when you get back, we're going to have a very serious conversation about this gambling problem of yours." The drive to the ranch gave Robert time to think about what he had gotten himself into. $5 million was a lot of money, even for him. But it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about proving that he hadn't made a complete fool of himself when he bought Thunder. When he arrived at the ranch, he found a circus waiting for him. There were news vans, reporters with cameras, and at least 50 people standing around the entrance gate. Diego was trying to keep them from coming onto the property, but he looked overwhelmed. Robert pulled up to the gate and rolled down his window. Immediately, microphones were shoved toward his face. "Mr. Blackstone, is it true you bet $5 million on your horse? What makes you think anyone can ride an animal that's injured multiple trainers? Is this just a publicity stunt?" Robert held up his hand for quiet. "I have no comment at this time. This is private property and I'm asking everyone to leave." But the crowd wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it seemed to be growing larger. Robert could see people with cameras and phones recording everything. He managed to get through the gate and drove up to the house, but he could see that some reporters were trying to find ways to get closer to Thunder's paddock. In the distance, Thunder himself was running along his fence line, clearly agitated by all the commotion. Robert's phone rang again. This time it was his business partner, Frank Morrison. "Robert, what the hell is going on? I've got 3 different reporters calling my office asking about your horse bet." "It's under control, Frank." "Under control? You bet $5 million on a horse that no one can ride. How is that under control?" "Look, I made the bet and I'm going to see it through. Either someone rides Thunder or I pay Charles the money." "And what if no one can ride him? $5 million isn't pocket change, even for you." 28 days had passed since Robert made his bet, and the situation at the ranch had become increasingly desperate. Despite all the media attention and the parade of potential riders who had come to look at Thunder, no one had actually attempted the challenge. Most took one look at the massive, aggressive stallion and quietly disappeared. The crowd that had gathered for what many were calling the ride of the century was an eclectic mix of wealthy spectators, reporters, horse enthusiasts, and curiosity seekers. They had set up chairs and canopies around Thunder's paddock like it was some kind of outdoor theater. Charles Rothschild sat in the front row, looking smugly confident as he sipped champagne from a crystal glass. Robert stood near the paddock fence, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Thunder was putting on quite a show for the assembled crowd, charging back and forth along the fence line, rearing up on his hind legs, and generally looking like the embodiment of untamed fury. "Magnificent beast," said Dr. Patricia Wells, the veterinarian, as she watched Thunder's display. "But I've never seen a horse with this much pent-up aggression. It's like he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." "More like the weight of $2 million, muttered Charles Rothschild, loud enough for Robert to hear. Linda Blackstone stood beside her husband, her face tight with worry. "Honey, maybe it's time to admit defeat. That $5 million isn't worth someone getting killed." "No one's going to get killed," Robert replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone will step up. They have to." But as the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, it was becoming clear that no one was going to step up. The professional riders who had expressed interest had all found excuses to back out. The amateur cowboys who had driven in from across the state had taken one look at Thunder and decided their lives were worth more than whatever bragging rights might come from riding him. The crowd was getting restless. Some people had driven hundreds of miles to see this spectacle, and it was looking like there wouldn't be a spectacle to see. "Maybe we should call it a day," suggested William Hayes, who had come to witness the bet he had helped arrange. "Give people time to go home and think about it." Robert was about to agree when he noticed an old pickup truck pulling into the ranch. The truck was at least 20 years old, with more rust than paint, and it looked completely out of place among the expensive cars and news vans that filled the parking area. The truck parked near the back of the crowd, and an elderly man climbed out slowly. He was maybe 70 years old, with silver hair and deeply tanned skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. But what caught Robert's attention was the way the man moved. He walked with a slight limp, and Robert could see that his left leg below the knee was artificial. The old man made his way through the crowd, moving slowly but purposefully. People barely noticed him as he passed. He wasn't dressed like the wealthy spectators in their designer ranch wear, and he certainly didn't look like a professional rider. He wore faded jeans, worn boots, and a simple flannel shirt that had seen better days. When he reached the paddock fence, the old man stopped and simply stood there, watching Thunder pace back and forth. Unlike everyone else, who pointed and talked excitedly about the horse's size and aggression, this man just watched quietly. Robert found himself walking over to where the old man stood. "Quite a crowd," Robert said, trying to start a conversation. The old man nodded without taking his eyes off Thunder. "Yep. Lots of excitement over one horse." "You interested in horses?" Robert asked. "I work with them some," the man replied. His voice was soft and steady, with a slight Texas drawl. "Name's Jimmy Rodriguez. I help out at the Veterans Healing Ranch about 30 miles from here." Robert had heard of the place. It was a non-profit organization that used horses to help veterans deal with trauma and adjust to civilian life. "That's good work you're doing there." Jimmy nodded. "Horses and veterans understand each other. Both have seen things that are hard to forget." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Thunder continue his restless pacing. Robert noticed that Jimmy's attention never wavered from the horse, and there was something different about the way he watched. Where others saw a dangerous animal, Jimmy seemed to be looking for something else. "He's in pain," Jimmy said quietly. "What do you mean?" Robert asked. "That horse, he's not angry, he's in pain. Emotional pain. I've seen it before in the veterans I work with. When you've been hurt bad enough, sometimes anger is the only way you know how to protect yourself." Robert studied Jimmy's weathered face. "You think you understand him?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe. I've been where he is. Different kind of prison, but still a prison." Before Robert could ask what he meant, Charles Rothschild's voice boomed across the crowd. "Well, Robert, it's getting late. Are we going to see this famous ride today, or should we all go home?" The crowd turned to look at Robert, waiting for his answer. He could feel the weight of their expectations along with the weight of his $5 million bet. "If someone wants to try, they're welcome to," Robert called back. "Anyone?" Charles asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What about you, old-timer?" He was looking directly at Jimmy. "You look like you might have some experience with horses." The crowd chuckled, and Robert felt a flash of anger at Charles's mocking tone. But Jimmy didn't seem bothered by it. "Might," Jimmy said simply. The laughter died as people realized he was serious. Charles's smile faded. "I beg your pardon?" Charles said. Jimmy turned to face the crowd for the first time. "I said I might try to ride your horse." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert stared at Jimmy in shock. This elderly man with a prosthetic leg wanted to attempt something that had scared off professional riders half his age. "Sir," Robert said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but this horse is extremely dangerous. He's injured several experienced trainers." "I understand," Jimmy replied. "But I've worked with traumatized animals before. Sometimes they just need someone who understands what they're going through." Charles Rothschild laughed loudly. "This is ridiculous. Robert, you can't seriously be considering letting this old man risk his life on your crazy bet." "I'm not old," Jimmy said mildly. "I'm experienced, and I'm not risking my life. I'm offering to help a horse that's in pain." Dr. Wells stepped forward. "Sir, I admire your courage, but I have to agree with Mr. Rothschild. This horse is unpredictable and extremely aggressive. One kick from him could kill you." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "Could be, but I've been kicked by life plenty of times already, and I'm still here. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." Robert found himself in an impossible position. Every logical part of his mind told him that letting this elderly veteran attempt to ride thunder was insane. But something about Jimmy's quiet confidence made him hesitate. "Tell me about your experience with horses," Robert said. "I've been working with them for about 10 years now," Jimmy replied. "Started after I got back from my third tour in Afghanistan. Lost my leg to an IED, lost my sense of purpose along with it. The horses at the healing ranch helped me find both. Again. But have you ever dealt with an animal this aggressive?" Jimmy looked back at Thunder, who had stopped pacing and was now standing near the fence watching the conversation with alert ears. "In Afghanistan, I worked with military dogs that had been traumatized by combat. Some of them were so damaged, they couldn't be around people anymore. Everyone said they should be put down. But a few of us believed they could be saved. We were usually right." "Horses aren't dogs," Charles pointed out. "No," Jimmy agreed. "They're bigger and stronger. But trauma is trauma no matter what species you're dealing with. That horse has been hurt somehow and now he doesn't trust anyone. I understand that feeling." Linda Blackstone stepped forward. "Mr. Rodriguez, I have to ask, why would you want to do this? You don't know us, and you certainly don't need to risk your safety for our bet." Jimmy smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Ma'am, it's not about your bet. It's about that horse. He reminds me of a lot of veterans I've worked with. They come to us angry and broken, convinced that nobody understands what they've been through. Sometimes all it takes is one person who's been through something similar to help them remember that they're not alone." The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped their chatter to listen to this unexpected turn of events. Robert looked at Jimmy, then at Thunder, then back at Jimmy. Everything in his experience told him this was a mistake, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, told him that maybe this old veteran saw something the rest of them had missed. "The bet requires that any attempt be witnessed by both parties," Robert said slowly. "If you're serious about this, we'll need to make it official." "I'm serious," Jimmy said. Charles Rothschild shook his head in disbelief. "Robert, this is insane. You're going to let a 70-year-old man with one leg try to ride a horse that's terrorized professional trainers." "I'm 67, Jimmy corrected gently. "And it's not about the leg you're missing, it's about what you do with the legs you have left." William Hayes pulled Robert aside. "Are you sure about this? If something happens to this man, you could be looking at a lawsuit that makes $5 million look like pocket change." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jimmy Rodriguez stood at the gate to Thunder's paddock. The crowd had grown silent, and even the reporters had stopped their constant chatter. Everyone seemed to sense that they were about to witness something extraordinary, though no one was quite sure what. Dr. Wells had finished her examination of Jimmy and reluctantly declared him fit for the attempt. The ambulance was parked nearby, its crew standing ready. Charles Rothschild sat in his chair with his arms crossed, clearly expecting to collect his $5 million within the next few minutes. Robert stood beside the paddock gate, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the latch. "Jimmy, are you absolutely certain about this?" Jimmy nodded, his weathered hands steady despite his age. "I'm certain, but remember, this isn't about conquering him. It's about communicating with him." Thunder stood at the far end of the paddock, his massive frame silhouetted against the Texas sky. His ears were pinned back, and his muscles were tense. Every line of his body spoke of barely controlled violence. "He knows something's different," Jimmy observed. "Look at how he's holding himself. He's ready for a fight. Maybe we should reconsider," Linda Blackstone whispered to her husband. But Jimmy was already opening the gate. "No," he said quietly. "He's been ready for a fight for too long. It's time someone offered him something different." Jimmy stepped into the paddock and immediately stopped, leaving the gate open behind him. He didn't move toward Thunder or make any aggressive gestures. He simply stood there, about 10 feet inside the fence, and waited. Thunder's reaction was immediate and explosive. He reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing at the air as he let out a sound that was part neigh and part scream. When he came back down, he charged directly at Jimmy. The crowd gasped and several people jumped to their feet, but Jimmy didn't move. He stood perfectly still as 2,000 pounds of angry horse thundered toward him. At the last possible second, Thunder slid to a stop just inches from Jimmy's face. The horse's nostrils flared as he snorted and tossed his massive head, but Jimmy remained motionless. "Easy, boy," Jimmy said in a voice so low that only Thunder could hear him. "I'm not here to hurt you." Thunder danced sideways, his hooves kicking up clouds of dust. He circled Jimmy at a distance of about 15 feet, never taking his eyes off the old veteran. Jimmy turned slowly to keep facing the horse, but he made no sudden movements. "What's he doing?" someone in the crowd whispered. "Letting Thunder make the first decision," Jimmy called back, never taking his eyes off the horse. "In his world, strangers mean trouble. I need to prove I'm different." For 10 minutes, Jimmy and Thunder engaged in a slow dance. Thunder would approach, then retreat. He would charge toward Jimmy, then veer away at the last second. Through it all, Jimmy remained calm and centered, speaking in low, soothing tones. "I know you're scared," Jimmy said during one of Thunder's closer passes. "I've been scared too. Spent 3 tours in Afghanistan wondering if today was the day I wouldn't come home. Fear makes you want to fight everyone and everything." Thunder's ears flicked forward slightly at the sound of Jimmy's voice. It was the first sign that the horse was actually listening rather than just reacting. "But fear doesn't have to control you," Jimmy continued. "I learned that the hard way. Lost my leg, lost my purpose, thought my life was over. But sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a new beginning." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thunder's posture began to change. His ears were no longer pinned flat against his head. His tail stopped lashing back and forth. He was still wary, still ready to bolt or fight, but something in his demeanor had shifted. Jimmy reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "Apple," he explained to the watching crowd. "Every horse I've ever met has a weakness for apples." He held the apple in his open palm and extended his arm toward Thunder. The horse's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, but he remained about 10 feet away. "You want it, don't you?" Jimmy said softly. "But you're afraid to trust me, I understand. Trust is the hardest thing to rebuild once it's been broken." For another 10 minutes, Jimmy held the apple while Thunder wrestled with his conflicting desires. The sweet smell of the fruit was clearly tempting, but his fear was stronger. "In Afghanistan," Jimmy said, his voice carrying across the silent paddock, "I had a buddy named Rodriguez, same last name as me, but no relation. Rodriguez was the best soldier I ever knew, but he had nightmares every night. The war had gotten inside his head and wouldn't let go." Thunder took a tentative step closer. Rodriguez was afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid to trust anyone. But slowly, little by little, we helped him remember that not everyone was the enemy. It took time, but he got better. Another step closer. "That's what you need, isn't it, boy? You need to remember that not everyone wants to hurt you." Thunder was now close enough that Jimmy could see his own reflection in the horse's dark eyes. The massive animal's breathing had slowed and his muscles were no longer bunched for flight or fight. "Take your time," Jimmy whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Charles Rothschild shifted impatiently in his chair. "How long is this going to take?" he called out. "As long as it takes," Robert replied, his voice filled with wonder at what he was witnessing. Jimmy continued to hold the apple, his arm steady despite what must have been considerable fatigue. Thunder stretched his neck forward, his nose getting closer and closer to Jimmy's outstretched hand. "That's it," Jimmy encouraged. "You remember what kindness feels like, don't you? Somewhere deep down you remember." Thunder's lips touched Jimmy's palm as he gently took the apple. For a moment, man and horse stood connected by that simple act of trust. "Good boy," Jimmy said softly, slowly raising his other hand to touch Thunder's neck. The horse tensed for a moment, then relaxed as Jimmy's weathered fingers made contact with his coat. The crowd watched in amazement as Jimmy began to stroke Thunder's neck with gentle, rhythmic movements. The horse that had terrorized professional trainers and cost Robert Blackstone a fortune in medical bills was standing quietly, allowing a 67-year-old veteran to pet him like a friendly dog. "I don't believe what I'm seeing," Dr. Wells murmured. "How is this possible?" Charles Rothschild demanded, his confident smirk replaced by confusion and concern. Jimmy continued to stroke Thunder's neck, gradually working his way toward the horse's shoulder. "Animals know when you understand their pain," he explained to the crowd. "This horse has been fighting everyone because he thought everyone was against him. He just needed someone to show him that wasn't true." After another 20 minutes of gentle contact, Jimmy stepped back and looked at Thunder seriously. "Now comes the real test, boy. I need to ask you to trust me completely." He walked over to where a halter hung on the fence post, the same halter that had been used by a dozen of failed trainers. Jimmy picked it up and returned to Thunder's side. "Easy, boy," Jimmy said as he slowly raised the halter toward Thunder's head. "This isn't about control. It's about partnership." Thunder tensed as he saw the halter, but he didn't bolt. Jimmy moved with infinite patience, allowing the horse to see and smell the halter before attempting to put it on. "That's right," Jimmy murmured as Thunder lowered his head slightly. "You remember what this is, but you also remember what it meant when other people used it. They used it to try to force you to do things. I'm asking for your permission." Slowly, carefully, Jimmy slipped the halter over Thunder's head. The horse accepted it without resistance, though his muscles remained tense. "Now we're partners," Jimmy said, stroking Thunder's nose. "What we do next, we do together." Jimmy led Thunder to the center of the paddock, moving slowly and allowing the horse to set the pace. When they reached the middle, Jimmy stopped and looked up at Thunder's massive frame. "This is the part where things get interesting," Jimmy called to the crowd. "I need to get on his back and he needs to let me stay there." "Jimmy," Robert called out, his voice tight with worry. "Are you sure you can do this with your leg?" "I've been getting on horses for 10 years with this leg," Jimmy replied. The trick is knowing which horses you can trust. Jimmy positioned himself beside Thunder's left shoulder. The horse was enormous, standing 18 hands high, which meant Jimmy would have to climb up nearly 6 feet to reach his back. "I know. You're big, boy," Jimmy said, patting Thunder's neck. "But I've climbed bigger mountains than you." Using a technique he had obviously perfected over years of practice, Jimmy grabbed Thunder's mane with his left hand and placed his right hand on the horse's back. Then in one smooth motion he pulled himself up, swinging his prosthetic leg over Thunder's back. The moment Jimmy settled onto Thunder's back, every person in the crowd held their breath. This was the moment when every other rider had been thrown, bucked off, or worse. Thunder stood perfectly still. "Easy, boy," Jimmy said, his voice calm despite the incredible risk he was taking. "How does this feel?" "Pretty good, right? Like maybe we were meant to be a team." Slowly, Jimmy asked Thunder to take a step forward. The massive horse responded immediately, moving with a grace that belied his size. There was no bucking, no rearing, no sign of the violence that had marked every previous attempt to ride him. The silence that followed Jimmy's successful ride was broken only by the sound of Thunder's gentle breathing and the distant hum of the news helicopters that had arrived to capture the story. For a moment, it seemed like the entire world had stopped to witness what many were already calling a miracle. Charles Rothschild sat in his chair, staring at Jimmy and Thunder with the expression of a man who had just watched the laws of physics break down in front of him. The $5 million he owed Robert was significant, but the blow to his pride was even more devastating. He had been so certain that the bet was a sure thing. "That was," Charles began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words. "Impossible?" Jimmy suggested gently, stroking Thunder's neck as the massive horse stood peacefully beside him. "I used to think a lot of things were impossible. Walking again after losing my leg, finding purpose after the war, sleeping through the night without nightmares. But horses taught me that impossible is usually just another word for haven't found the right approach yet." Robert Blackstone walked slowly toward Jimmy and Thunder, his face still wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. "Jimmy, I don't know how to thank you. 9 months I've been trying to help this horse, and in 2 hours you've accomplished what I thought couldn't be done." "You don't need to thank me," Jimmy replied. "I should be thanking you. Do you have any idea how long it's been since I felt this useful?" Thunder lowered his massive head and gently bumped Jimmy's shoulder, as if agreeing with his new friend's sentiment. Dr. Wells approached cautiously, her medical bag in hand. "Jimmy, are you injured at all? Any pain or discomfort?" Jimmy laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. "Doc, I feel better than I have in years. That horse didn't hurt me. If anything, he healed something I didn't even know was still broken." The crowd was slowly dispersing, with many people coming up to shake Jimmy's hand or ask for photos. The reporters were busy filing their stories about the miracle in Texas and the veteran who tamed the wild horse. But Jimmy's attention remained focused on Thunder. He could see that the horse was becoming overwhelmed by all the attention and activity. "He needs some quiet time," Jimmy told Robert. "All this excitement isn't good for him. He's been overstimulated for months, and now he needs space to process what just happened." Robert nodded immediately. "Whatever you think is best, you obviously understand him better than anyone." "Would it be possible for me to stay here tonight?" Jimmy asked. "I don't want to leave him alone right after we've made this connection. Tomorrow I can start driving back to the healing ranch, but tonight—" "Of course," Robert said quickly. "You can stay as long as you want. We have a guest house that's completely private." As the crowd finally dispersed and the ranch returned to something approaching normal, Jimmy led Thunder back to his paddock. But something remarkable happened when they reached the gate. Thunder stopped and looked back at Jimmy with what could only be described as concern. "I'm not leaving you, boy," Jimmy said softly. "I'm just going to be right here." He pointed to a chair someone had brought over and placed near the paddock fence. "You get some rest and I'll keep an eye on things." Thunder seemed to understand. He walked into his paddock and, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, lay down in the soft grass near the fence where Jimmy was sitting. Within minutes, the massive horse was asleep. "I've never seen him do that," Robert said, watching, in amazement. He's never relaxed enough to lie down before. Sleep is trust, Jimmy explained. When a horse lies down, he's telling you that he feels safe. Thunder hasn't felt safe in a very long time. As the sun set over the Texas ranch, Jimmy sat in his chair beside Thunder's paddock, occasionally reaching through the fence to stroke the sleeping horse's neck. Robert brought him dinner and a cup of coffee, and they sat together in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Robert asked eventually. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder's peaceful sleep. "That depends on what you want to happen. You won your bet, you've got your $5 million, and you've proven that Thunder can be ridden. Mission accomplished." But Robert sensed there was more. But Thunder's journey is just beginning. What we did today was break through his fear and anger. Now comes the harder part, helping him learn to trust the world again. That's not something that happens overnight. Robert studied Jimmy's weathered face in the gathering darkness. "Are you saying you'd be willing to continue working with him?" "If you'd have me," Jimmy replied. "I've got vacation time saved up from the healing ranch, and my supervisor is pretty understanding about these kinds of situations. A lot of our volunteers are veterans who understand the importance of helping someone heal. What would you need?" Jimmy smiled. "Not much. A place to sleep, some simple food, and permission to spend time with Thunder. The real work doesn't require expensive equipment or fancy techniques. It just requires patience and consistency." Over the next 3 weeks, Jimmy became a fixture at the ranch. Every morning, he would arrive at Thunder's paddock just after sunrise. He would spend the entire day with the horse, sometimes riding, sometimes just talking, often simply sitting quietly nearby while Thunder grazed. The transformation in Thunder was remarkable. The horse that had once been a symbol of untamed fury became gentle and responsive. He learned to trust not just Jimmy, but other people as well. Diego, the ranch manager, was the first to successfully approach Thunder without Jimmy present. "It's like he's a completely different animal," Diego told Robert one morning as they watched Jimmy put Thunder through a series of exercises. "Yesterday, I was able to brush him down without any problems. A month ago, he would have tried to kick my head off." But the transformation wasn't limited to Thunder. Jimmy himself seemed to be changing as well. The quiet sadness that had shadowed his eyes when he first arrived was gradually being replaced by something that looked very much like joy. "Working with Thunder has reminded me of something I had forgotten," Jimmy told Robert one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I had started to think that my best days were behind me, that maybe I was just taking up space in the world. But Thunder needed me, and that gave me purpose again." "You've given me something too," Robert replied. "For 9 months I looked at Thunder and saw my failure, my inability to solve a problem with money and determination. But you've shown me that some problems can only be solved with understanding and compassion." As the weeks passed, word of Thunder's transformation spread throughout the horse community. Other owners with problem horses began contacting Robert, asking if Jimmy might be willing to help them as well. "I've been thinking," Jimmy said one evening. "What if we expanded this? The healing ranch where I work helps veterans, but there are a lot of horses out there like Thunder who need help too. And there are veterans like me who need purpose. What if we could bring them together?" Robert leaned forward in his chair, interested. "What are you thinking?" "A program where veterans work with traumatized horses. Both groups understand what it's like to carry invisible wounds. Both groups know what it feels like to be written off as hopeless cases. Maybe they can help heal each other." The idea excited Robert more than any business deal he had ever considered. "What would you need to make something like that happen?" "Space, funding, and horses that need help," Jimmy replied. "You've got the space right here. As for funding," Robert smiled, "I think I can handle that part. And between your connections and mine, I'm sure we can find plenty of horses that need help." 3 months later, the Blackstone Veterans and Equine Healing Center held its grand opening. The facility occupied 50 acres of Robert's ranch and included stables, training areas, and comfortable accommodations for veterans who came to participate in the program. Thunder became the program's first therapy horse, working with veterans who were struggling with PTSD, depression, and the challenge of adjusting to civilian life. Under Jimmy's guidance, Thunder learned to sense when someone was having a panic attack and would move close to provide comfort. His gentle presence and calm energy helped dozens of veterans begin their own healing journeys. Charles Rothschild, perhaps motivated by guilt over his initial skepticism, became one of the program's largest donors. "I was wrong about that horse," he admitted to Robert at the center's opening ceremony. "And I was wrong about that old veteran too. Sometimes the best things come in packages you don't expect." Jimmy officially retired from his position at the original healing ranch and became the full-time director of the new center. He moved into a small house on the property, just a few hundred yards from Thunder's pasture. Every morning, Jimmy would walk out to the pasture where Thunder would be waiting for him. The massive horse would come over to the fence and gently bump Jimmy's shoulder with his head, their personal greeting that had developed over the months they had worked together. "Morning, partner," Jimmy would say, stroking Thunder's neck. "Ready for another day of helping people?" Thunder would snort softly and follow Jimmy to whatever area of the facility they were needed. Together, they would work with veterans who had lost hope, helping them remember that healing was possible and that they weren't alone in their struggles.